On February 19, 1915, Allied battleships opened fire on the Ottoman forts guarding the entrance to the Dardanelles Strait. Winston Churchill believed this alone would win the campaign. Battleships would silence the coastal guns, sweep the minefields, and open a path straight to Constantinople. No troops needed. 27 days later, on March 18th, 3 Allied battleships struck mines and sank in a single afternoon. The naval plan was dead. Instead of abandoning the operation, the Allies escalated it, a full land invasion. That invasion didn't begin for another 38 days, on April 25th. 38 days in which the Ottoman defenders dug in, reinforced, and prepared for exactly the landing that was coming. By the time it was over in January 1916, the campaign had cost roughly 500,000 casualties on both sides combined, well over 100,000 of them dead, achieved none of its strategic objectives, and become one of the defining military disasters of the First World War. The standard story blames Churchill's ambition, or Ottoman resilience, or simple bad luck. But the campaign's fate was sealed, not by any single battle. It was sealed in the 38 days between the naval failure and the land invasion, when everyone involved could see the surprise was gone and proceeded anyway. So what actually killed the Gallipoli campaign? Was it ever really a plan that could have worked? By late 1914, the Western Front had calcified into trench deadlock. Casualties were staggering. The front line barely moved. British political and military leadership went looking for a way to break the stalemate elsewhere. In early January 1915, Russia formally requested a demonstration against Ottoman forces to relieve pressure from a Turkish offensive threatening the Caucasus front. The request landed in London at the exact moment Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, had already convinced himself that Ottoman coastal defenses in the Dardanelles were weak enough to fall to naval bombardment alone. His confidence rested partly on faulty intelligence, reports that significantly understated how many Ottoman troops actually guarded the strait. The strategic logic on its own terms wasn't absurd. Forcing the Dardanelles could knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, reopen a supply corridor to Russia through the Black Sea, and pull wavering Balkan states into the Allied camp. The objective wasn't the problem. The problem was that the plan to reach it rested on assumptions nobody seriously tested before troops and ships were committed. First, the campaign began as a naval-only operation because that was the cheapest option politically, not because it was the soundest option militarily. A purely naval assault meant no divisions diverted from the Western Front, which mattered to a British high command reluctant to weaken the main effort in France. Churchill argued the Ottoman forts were exposed, reducible by ship-based gunfire alone, letting minesweepers clear the strait without a single soldier landing. Other military leaders were skeptical. They favored a longer, better-resourced combined operation. First Sea Lord John Fisher, head of the Royal Navy, opposed the plan from the start and said so repeatedly. He was overruled. 3 months later, once the campaign had failed to deliver anything close to what Churchill promised, Fisher resigned in protest, the clearest signal available that Churchill's own top admiral had never believed in the operation he championed. The naval-only plan won anyway, not because it was judged more likely to succeed, but because it was judged cheaper to attempt. Second, the naval bombardment failed on March 18th. And the men who beat it weren't the men who get the credit. Command of the Strait's defenses belonged to Cevat Pasha, the Ottoman officer running the Dardanelles fortified area, working alongside German Vice Admiral Guido von Usedom. 10 days before the battle, the Ottoman mine layer Nusret slipped out under cover of darkness and laid a fresh row of mines in Erenköy Bay, parallel to the strait, not across it, exactly where Allied ships would turn to bring their guns to bear on the forts. Nobody on the Allied side found it. On March 18th, with more than half their artillery ammunition already spent and no way to replace it, Cevat Pasha's gunners held their positions rather than chase the fleet. They didn't need to. The French battleship Bouvet struck Nusret's mines first, sinking in minutes, with most of her 674-man crew. 2 more battleships followed her down before the day was over. The assumption that naval firepower alone would force capitulation collapsed in an afternoon. Beaten by a mine layer and a fortress commander, history barely remembers. Third, the 38-day gap between the naval failure and the land invasion was the single most costly strategic decision of the entire campaign. Having lost the element of surprise and abandoned the fiction that this could be won cheaply, Allied command chose to escalate to a full land invasion rather than withdraw. But the invasion force wasn't ready to move immediately. Logistics, troop transport, and planning took over a month to assemble. 6 days after the naval defeat, on March 24th, the Ottomans formed a new Fifth Army, specifically to defend the peninsula, and gave command to Lehmann von Sanders, the German general already running their military mission. He had 5 weeks. He used every day of it, repositioning divisions, digging fortifications along the ridgelines, correctly guessing the Allies would land near Cape Helles and the beach later called Anzac Cove. Not every Ottoman commander agreed with his approach. Mustafa Kemal argued the defenders were spread too thin along the beaches to stop a landing outright, and pushed for concentrating forces inland instead. Von Sanders kept the bulk of his divisions in reserve regardless, ready to rush wherever the Allies actually came ashore. That 5-week window gave defenders who now knew precisely where an attack was coming all the time they needed. The one advantage an amphibious landing depends on most, surprise, was allowed to evaporate in plain sight of the enemy. Fourth, even after landing, Allied forces never achieved the numerical advantage the operations planners had assumed. The popular image of Gallipoli is overwhelming Allied numbers, thrown uselessly against a smaller Ottoman defense. The actual troop count tells a different story. By the campaign's end, roughly 15 Allied divisions faced approximately 16 Ottoman divisions, defending home territory they knew intimately. This was never the lopsided mismatch the initial planning had implicitly counted on. Ottoman forces, under commanders including the same Mustafa Kemal, who'd led the 19th Division since the landings began, mounted a defense on ground they controlled, against an attacking force with no numerical edge to compensate for the disadvantage of assaulting fortified positions from the sea. Fifth, British political commitment to the campaign stayed lukewarm through most of 1915, which meant reinforcement was consistently too small and too late. Even after the initial landings failed to break through, London's backing for Gallipoli never firmed up. Reinforcements arrived in increments rather than the decisive concentration the situation demanded. Command structures shifted, oversight fragmented between committees. No single figure held the authority or the resources to force a decisive escalation or a clean withdrawal. The campaign was sustained just enough to keep bleeding, never resourced enough to succeed. The conventional account of Gallipoli treats it as Ottoman heroism against Allied incompetence, or, alternatively, as a simple case of Churchill's reckless overconfidence. Both framings miss the sharper mechanism underneath. This wasn't one catastrophic decision. It was a sequence of individually defensible choices, each one closing off the option that might have saved the operation. Choosing the cheap naval-only plan was a rational cost-saving move, given the demands of the Western Front. Escalating to a land invasion after the naval failure, rather than accepting the loss and withdrawing, was the more rational choice once political prestige was already invested. But the 38-day delay is where rationality broke down completely. Everyone involved could see the strategic logic of speed. The operation proceeded slowly anyway, because no institutional mechanism existed to force the pace the situation actually required. Gallipoli didn't fail because the Ottoman Empire was underestimated in the abstract. It failed because a campaign that depended entirely on surprise was allowed to lose that surprise in full view of a defender who used the delay exactly as well as the attacker wasted it. Lyman von Sanders didn't win Gallipoli through genius alone. He won it because Allied command handed him 5 weeks to prepare for a landing everyone already knew was coming. That's the pattern worth carrying forward. Military disasters are rarely the product of a single bad decision made in a moment of panic. They're more often a sequence of individually reasonable choices made by different people at different points, none of whom had the authority or the information to see how badly they added up. The next video in this series follows that same pattern back to where the Ottoman Empire's diplomatic room to maneuver first began closing, decades before a single shot was fired at the Dardanelles.